Golden Blue Tube here with you for our playoff poll, week number 4. The chaos continues. Now, if you want to, you can check out what the playoff committee came up with. I don't really care. I'm going to get into my rankings, but they're there if you want to check it out. And, of course, before we actually get into the rankings, we go to the chaos meter. And this week, we actually bumped it up just a tad right into the extreme. Not because there was a lot of upsets, but because of how teams played, and there were a couple of upsets. So let's look at the 2 teams that were knocked out. The first team is Oregon. Yeah, that one surprised me a good bit. I know Arizona State has good defense, but last week for me, Oregon was number 5. Knocked them out. That gives them their second loss, and they just don't have the wins to back up that second loss. So they do have the win at USC, which USC climbed back into the polls, but then, the loss versus Auburn in the beginning of the season, and then coupled that with the loss at Arizona State, Oregon is out. The second team that's out is a team that's come in and out, in and out, in and out, and that is Michigan. And that's just because of some other one-loss teams staying in the mix. This week they are out. They do have some pretty decent wins. They have a win versus Iowa, versus Notre Dame, and at Indiana. And I do think that is kind of a quality win. Indiana is a bowl team. But they do have those 2 losses at Wisconsin and at Penn State, which they're good teams, but that's still 2 losses. So those are the 2 that I knocked out. So let's get into the top 10. So number 10 is Penn State. Last week I had them ranked number 6, and they had a chance to significantly increase their ranking against Ohio State, but they fell short. They were very competitive, though. That was a very good game after they fell behind early. They got good wins against Iowa, versus Michigan, and versus Indiana. And then they have those 2 losses at Minnesota and at Ohio State. But those are some pretty good losses. No loss is good, but those are some good teams to lose to. Their remaining schedule is versus a bad Rutgers team. So Penn State at this point can't really do much to increase their ranking. So for this week, number 10 is Penn State. Climbing back into our poll is Baylor at number 9. Last week, of course, they were non-ranked after that loss to Oklahoma State that looked like was going to be a win at the beginning. Turned out to be a loss. They do have wins versus Iowa State, at Kansas State, and at Oklahoma State. That's actually a pretty good win at Oklahoma State. They're looking much, much better late in the year. And then, of course, Baylor has that loss versus Oklahoma, but they're going to get a chance to avenge that loss in the Big 12 championship. Their remaining schedule is at a terrible Kansas team, so that's not going to really help much. It will be the Big 12 championship that determines their final ranking in our poll. So Baylor, number 9. Coming in at number 8 is the team that beat Baylor, and that's Oklahoma. Last week I had them ranked at number 7. They really didn't do anything wrong to fall. It's just the way the teams fell into my poll this week. They have wins versus Iowa State, and then that good win against Baylor. And their loss at Kansas State, like I said, a loss is not good, but Kansas State is a decent team. They will be going to a bowl, and they still have Oklahoma State on the road coming up. So they actually have 2 games to bump up their ranking and try to sneak into the playoffs. They have at Oklahoma State to finish off the season, and then they will get Baylor in the Big 12 championship. That should be a big-time shootout. I don't know who's going to win that game, because if the Baylor of the first half of the first meeting between these 2 teams shows up for the whole game, then it will be Baylor. But if it's the second half, it will be Oklahoma. So We will have to see if either team can put a whole game together and who comes out on top. And that will play a significant role in the playoffs. Number 7. Georgia. From week to week, I have no idea where to put you. And I did save your hat from last week. I put you back in the poll at number 4. You have good wins against Notre Dame. That's a pretty good win. You have a win against a decent Florida, at Auburn, and Texas A&M. And then you have that despicable loss against South Carolina. I put you back in my poll last week at number 4. And what happens? Sure, you beat Texas A&M, but you still look bad. And I'm not buying into the hype that Florida and Auburn were this great teams that boosted your resume. They're okay, but they're not great teams, okay? So, to me, it's not just those good, decent wins and that one pretty good win against Notre Dame. It's that bad loss and the eye test. You just don't pass the eye test. Sorry, Georgia. You're out of my top 4. You have Georgia Tech remaining. That's a bad team. And in the SEC Championship. So we will see how your defense does against LSU's offense. But for right now, you fall to number 7. While I'm still on the subject of Georgia, I came up with this idea. If Georgia goes on to win the national championship, not make the playoffs, not get to the national championship, wins the national championship, I will change this channel to black and red tube, and I will wear all Georgia for the entire week after the national championship. So there you go, Georgia. If you really want to stick it to gold and blue tube, win the national championship, and I will don the Georgia apparel. So there's the challenge. I'm very confident about this. I don't think it's going to happen. Let's move on to number 6. Alabama. Last week I had them at number 9. They have a decent win against Texas A&M and a not so terrible loss against LSU, but it's still a loss. Of course, the loss of Tua for the season, that's not good. That might be worse than the loss to LSU. And of course, they have a game at Auburn, the Iron Bowl, and Auburn's a decent team this year. Not good. I don't think Auburn's that good of a team, but decent. They will be going to a bowl. And who knows, maybe if total chaos happens, Alabama will be able to sneak into the playoffs. A lot of things would have to happen, but it's happened before. Right now, I have them at number 6, and they didn't really do anything great to get bumped up to number 6, but like I said, because of other teams looking bad, and, they didn't look too bad in their game, and, one lost team sneaking back in, that's just where they ended up, number 6. Let's get into our top 5. Number 5 was kicked out last week, and that was Minnesota, and that was because of that loss at Iowa. They have a great win against Penn State. They have one loss, and they have a chance to get into the Big Ten Championship with a win against Wisconsin, which is their next game. So Minnesota, I know it's crazy, Minnesota has a real shot to get into the playoffs. If they beat Wisconsin and then go on and beat Ohio State for the Big Ten Championship, they will make that conversation very, very interesting. And now you're starting to see why I put the chaos meter up at extreme, because a lot of teams looked way better. Some teams looked not so great. Georgia again. I know you won, but you still looked bad. And that's what bumped my chaos meter up to extreme. Not way up there, but into it. So the top 4 teams that I have, that means if my poll ended today, according to me, these would be the teams that would get into the playoffs. Number 4 would be Utah. Utah's defense is great, but they also have a decent offense that's catching up with their defense to go along with that. They're not just one-sided like Georgia. So last week I had them at number 8. They won again. They have wins against Arizona State and at Washington, and they lost at USC. USC climbing back into the polls, so that loss doesn't look as bad. They will get Colorado to finish the season, And then if they can win the Pac-12 championship, they also will make the playoff conversation very interesting. However, Oregon losing this past week didn't help things much for Utah. But they're still looking good right now, and I have them at number 4. Number 3, LSU. LSU has a pretty good resume. They have wins against a decent Florida and a decent Auburn and a good Alabama at Alabama. That was a good win. They're undefeated. Last week, I had them ranked number 1. The reason they fell to number 3, I just thought the other two teams looked more impressive. Their remaining schedule is Texas A&M, so they can get one more decent win under their belt before they head to the SEC Championship to play Georgia. LSU. Just end it right there. Don't even let Georgia get into the playoffs. End it right there. So they'll be playing Georgia in the SEC Championship. So my top 2 teams. Number 2, Clemson. Last week I had them at number 3. Now I have them at number 2. They beat the brakes off of Wake Forest, and Wake Forest, you know, they're a pretty decent team. They did the same thing to Texas A&M, which Georgia looked bad against Texas A&M. I know I keep bringing up Georgia, but that's because I had to eat crow because of Georgia last week. So yes, it's going to keep coming. So the win against Texas A&M and the win against Wake Forest, coupled that with they're undefeated, they're looking better and better. And next week, well, tomorrow, they get South Carolina, who beat Georgia. So that'll be another thing we can compare Clemson to Georgia with. Last week I had them at number 3. This week I have Clemson at number 2. So that brings us to the number 1 ranked team in our poll, and that's Ohio State. Last week I had them at number 2. They are undefeated. They have wins against Cincinnati, at Indiana, against a good Wisconsin and a good Penn State team. They looked a little shaky there for a few minutes against Penn State. That's okay. They won. Remaining schedule at their rival Michigan. If they beat Michigan, they can get into the Big Ten Championship undefeated. They're going either way, but they could end up undefeated if they handle business there. They're number 1 in points per game and points against. They are the number 1 team in the nation. Teams are going to have trouble with Ohio State in the playoffs whenever they make it. So let's see if any of the other teams can give Ohio State a game. Right now, I see Ohio State as the national champion, and so we'll see how that works out. But for me, that's how I think it's going to work out. Chaos meter set to extreme because a lot of jumbling around. There were some losses. There were some teams not playing good, teams stepping up. So that's why we set the chaos meter at extreme. So I hope you enjoyed this video, even if you're a Georgia fan. Still hope you liked it. And I hope you join me next time on my video. Oh, and let's go Mountaineers. I just thought I'd throw that in there.